Good morning. Kate and I have been looking forward to joining you at this conference. As poets, we are both new to the field of digital humanities and have been excited not only by what we're learning about this discipline, but also by what it's been teaching us about literature and creative writing. Poems are often small on the outside, but they are large on the inside, not only in how they use tiny elements of meter, rhyme, and literary figure to access theme, but also in the complexity with which their elements interact. In this, they are unique in how they help us to understand scale and scope. William Blake was able to see a world in a grain of sand and hold eternity in an hour. We see poems as multidimensional living things, as complex in their movements as a brain or a heart. And that is the main perspective we want to share with you today, that big data and uncertainty, or to introduce a phrase I'll discuss a bit more later, complex capta, can describe individual poems as well as digital libraries, and that exploring poems in these terms might actually enhance rather than compete with close readings. Under an International Digging into Data Challenge grant, we recently embarked on a poetry visualization project with a group of computer scientists at Oxford University and our own University of Utah. Together, we are working to see whether and how new software that treats poems as large data sets might help literary scholars and poets make observations, interpretations, and poems that might not otherwise be possible. While our initial visualizations will help scholars to perceive and analyze sonic devices in individual poems, eventually we hope to be able to use these original tools to analyze large poetry corpora, such as those available online through organizations like the Poetry Foundation and the Academy of American Poets.
So I want to start by saying I think it's great that we're following Brian, because he said some things that are very instructive and useful to us. This project, I'm a poet, and that's really what I do. I write poems and I write essays about poetry. So this project kind of fell into my lap through a variety of circumstances, which might be more true of digital humanities scholars than we think. My husband, Chris, who's the blonde guy up in the corner, is a computer scientist specializing in large-scale visualizations and simulations of complex systems, including heart, brain, fire explosions, etc. And when some colleagues of his in Oxford, that would be Alfie and Min, thought that they wanted to pursue a project in visualizing poetry, I was the poet they knew. I was actually kind of jittery about the idea. Min approached me in Dodgeville, Germany at a big computer science retreat that we go to on a regular basis, and he was just sure that I should be doing this thing. I wasn't sure at all. In the unlikely event that we actually got this very highly competitive grant, I imagined that I might end up having to spend many years thinking about things that frankly I wasn't interested in thinking about. In particular, counting anything, quantifying anything within poems or across large collections of poems. I understand these to be extraordinarily useful things to do, potentially even very profound activities, but I also understood them to be best performed by other people. But Min kept asking me, so what are you interested in doing if you're not interested in doing these other things? And when I started to think about it, everything that came to mind just seemed to be too big and too complicated. But I did have just enough information to be dangerous, because Chris does these time-dependent models of things that are very complex. It seemed to me, as I considered it, that we really should be able to do some interesting things with poems as complex as they are, whether that was visualizing poetic music or locating the seeds of poetic schools and movements in earlier poets that we have never yet associated with these movements. So my ideas were a little bit extravagant, and in fact I tried to make them as extravagant as I possibly could, but Min continued to seem open and to want to hear about them. In retrospect, it's not clear to me that he understood going in that poems or poetic history are large data sets in the ways that I understood them even going in to be, as complex, dynamic, and unstable systems in motion, uncertain, and experiential. Even I wasn't thinking very much then about how a reader participates in and that even enables a poem's complexity, dynamism, and instability, but he was open to hearing about all these things.
So initially, we thought that we'd begin our project by visualizing meter and rhyme, two foundational but far from simple poetic elements. In preparation for our first meeting with our entire team, Kate and I chose 12 British and American poems from a range of time periods, written in various forms, rhyme schemes, meters, and tones. We included traditional and experimental sonnets and villanelles, as well as longer pieces with regular rhyme schemes and or accentual meters. And at this point, we intentionally excluded free verse poems because we thought, wrongly, it turns out, that they would make our task of finding and visualizing sonic patterns more difficult. In Oxford, we viewed preliminary visualizations of our test poems, and here are a few examples. Kate and I were introduced to parallel coordinates, tree maps, word clouds, and other methods of text and data visualization that frankly were entirely new to us. We saw some of these images were quite visually striking and intriguing. Others were confusing or gave us, on the one hand, information already available to attentive or even not especially attentive readers, like full rhymes among endwords. Or on the other hand, information unlikely to be deeply useful, like the number of words in a poem. Obviously, our whole team wants to develop software whose visualizations will be aesthetically rich while revealing new structures and insights. We want it, for example, to be able to show not only the usual Shakespearean sonnet rhymes we expect, but also the alternate ghostly patterns that Philip C. McGuire points out sometimes exist in these same words. And that's to say nothing of internal rhymes, assonance, anaphora, and other devices like metaphor. Gradually, we realized that these first visualizations were missing the experiential quality of poetry. I said at the beginning that we see poems as living and relational. Their components move and interact not only with each other, but with us as readers. And these relationships occur both in space and in and through time. In other words, they are multidimensional. To try to explain what we meant by this, Kate spontaneously wrote Louise Bogan's poem Night on a whiteboard, and I'd like to read it for you now. The cold, remote islands and the blue estuaries, where what breathes the restless wind of the inlets, and what drinks the incoming tide, where shell and weed wait upon the salt wash of the sea, and the clear nights of stars swing their lights westward to set behind the land, where the pulse clinging to the rocks renews itself forever, where, again on cloudless nights, the water reflects the firmament's partial setting. Oh, remember in your narrowing, dark hours that more things move than blood in the heart. At first, Kate meant to bring attention to the poem's punctuation and repetitions in lines 3 and 5, where what breathes, and what drinks. These emphatic but non-metrical internal pauses momentarily halt the forward movement of the poem. The repetition suspends us and sends us briefly backward before moving on. But there's more happening here as well. As we talked, we noticed the important modulation between short and long vowels. Cold, remote, to blue, estuaries, to incoming, for example. Or how the long E sounds at the end of estuaries gets picked up again in breathes, before it shortens in restless and inlets. These rhymes, and rhymes in general we came to see, by virtue of being echoes, are both progressions and returns, moving both forward and backward in time. Here was a free verse poem whose sonic and rhythmic richness was helping us to see its unique connections and patterns, perhaps because we weren't blinded to them by expectations for a regular rhyme scheme or meter. We're now using Night as our touchstone poem. So this is the first visualization that followed our Oxford meeting. It embraces the poem's temporality quite literally, but in a rather flat, one-dimensional way, showing the duration of each word and pause within lines based on data from recordings of Kate, me, and a computer reading the text out loud. It retains the general shape of the poem, which can be helpful as we think about characteristics like lineation and stanza breaks, and how those bounded spaces affect our engagement with poetry. But these monochrome blocks do nothing to show temporal or sonic relationships and changes. Here, we're starting to get a little more information. This visualization includes not only the poem's words, but also the phonetic characters for each sound. Those are the colored blocks. Using the International Phonetic Alphabet and additional colors, we can see at a glance the distribution of vowel and consonant sounds. The vowels are pink, the consonants are blue, and the gray squares are punctuation, just in between, in between those words. Looking carefully, we can see whether and where a particular phoneme is repeated throughout the poem, a process that might reveal connections we hadn't noticed before if we or the software were focused on alphabetic letters exclusively. But it's still not clear how these sounds connect through time, or how closely related sounds, the long O's and Oo's, for instance, relate to each other. This next visualization is more time-dependent, with arcs showing the frequency and placement of repeated sounds throughout the poem. And this is a method some of you might know is that's sometimes used to show musical refrains. The bottom image shows the entire poem, suggests that its sonic repetitions are fairly dense, comprising both smaller, fleeting pairings and other more dominant patterns that link several times throughout the poem. One problem, though, is that it's hard to see detail. Even if we magnify the image like I've done with just a section of the poem up in the top image, it's still difficult to follow individual arcs. Perhaps hovering over or clicking a particular arc could highlight in a contrasting color all arcs that participate in that same phonetic sequence. But what qualifies as a traceable sound? And looking at this particular example, we wondered why were repetitions of the words and of marked, but not the. We wondered whether the final syllables, only final syllables were considered in determining the rhymes. And if that's the case, why was and not linked with islands, or westward not linked with estuaries, or restless, inlets, and other words using the same cluster of sounds? In other words, we perceived in the poem more blurring and overlap of categories than did our collaborators, who are more accustomed to working with scholars in the hard sciences. Our line of questioning rises from our roots in the humanities. Poet Anne Lauterbach, in her chapbook The Given and the Chosen, says, quote, "My sense of pleasure, both as a writer and as a viewer or a reader, derives in part from feeling at the indeterminate threshold the shift between the given and the chosen," end quote. And this is a sensibility that Johanna Drucker examines in relation to visualization in her 2011 DHQ article on this subject. Drucker contrasts what she calls a realist approach to data as empirically measured, unambiguous, pre-existing sets of givens, with humanist engagement with what she calls capta, that which is taken or interpreted, nuanced, shaped through experience. In Drucker's view, digital humanists should consciously treat all data as capta. Information visualizations should literally be informed by the range of situated expressiveness that phrase describes. And this is, I think, very like what Ben was discussing earlier. Drucker argues, for instance, that, quote, "the task of representing ambiguity and uncertainty has to be distinguished from a second task, that of using interpretations that arise in observer codependence, characterized by ambiguity and uncertainty, as the basis on which a representation is constructed. This is the difference between putting many kinds of points on a map to show degrees of uncertainty by shades of color, degrees of crispness, transparency, etc., and creating an entire map whose coordinate grid is constructed as an effect of these ambiguities, end quote. So that is the kind of multidimensional experience that our team is working to evoke in our visualizations. So far, we're not aware of other teams approaching textual visualizations in quite this same way. Even the close reading aid, Myopia, which Laura Mandel presented at this summer's Digital Humanities Conference, does not seem to incorporate this disciplinary perspective into its design. Consequently, although it deals with more complexity in poetry than other programs, and attends to meter, sound, syntax, and other poetic devices like metaphor and personification, it does so through rigid encoding hierarchies developed for other disciplines. The inevitable result is dissipation of poetic energies and loss of complex dynamic relationships, weaknesses that Mandel acknowledges. Emory University's Rebecca Sutton-Koser, who blogged about this and other conference sessions, noted the visual homogenization and diluted aesthetic experience that also plagues other poetry visualization efforts at this time.
So Drucker's piece, which Julie dug up not too long ago, for me represented a real turning point in the way that I was thinking about this, and then also in what I was able to communicate to our collaborators. And I think what you're seeing in the visualizations that we just showed are the before to an after that we hope is coming very soon, in which the visualizations are going to look quite a bit different. So she also, and Drucker also gave me, I think, a really useful framework for understanding my own very mixed response to the Myopia project, even acknowledging and understanding the value that is in it, as Julie pointed out. And that is that this project, like so many other digital humanities projects, appears to require poets and close readers to change our priorities and downgrade our needs and desires in order to fit the data model, rather than creating something that helps us to pursue the thing that matters to us most. And that goes back to my initial jitters about embarking on something like this, right? Is this going to be something that's about my own values as a scholar and as a poet, or am I going to have to adapt my values to somebody else's model of what is really important? In a sense, this is also revealed by what the creators of Myopia identify as the big payoff of the program, which is that it will save close readers time. My immediate response to that was twofold. First, no, it won't. And second, and if it does, so what? Who really cares? In fact, I would happily succumb to what I believe would be the slower, more laborious processes of using the program if I thought it would actually give me a deeper interaction with and experience of the poem through close reading than I would get without the program. So what we want is a tool that will enhance and intensify that experience of close reading, not one that is going to shift our focus away from close reading and into something else. So obviously we faced cultural differences with our collaborators that are sort of captured by this distinction between data as the driving value and CAPTA on the other hand. But our collaborators, I think, were very usefully pressing us on the question of what metaphor it was that we wanted to use to describe poems. And we went through a number of different metaphors: pressure cooker, expanding universe, et cetera, that weren't really particularly useful. But in order to get at this question, Julie and I came to realize that we needed to begin to describe, not only for them but for ourselves, how in very specific underlying ways we think poems work on readers and how readers work on poems, especially in time. In other words, suddenly my own learning curve, which had been constant and steep, included not only learning about visualization, which I knew that I didn't understand, but also teaching myself by engaging them through a new framework, new things about poems, which I had thought I understood very well indeed. So this has turned out for us, I think, to be the upside of the research so far, and it's one that Kate Singer, who's interviewed about myopia for Kieser's Tech Know-How blog, which is up on the slide, highlights this as well. Mandel reports that what Julie and I have continued to experience since our visit to Oxford, that working on the visualization has forced us to think more deeply and more clearly about poetry. This thinking has brought us new insights about how poems work. Interestingly, it's not actual visualizations, but visualizations that we have imagined that have so far brought us to these insights. But we continue to have very high hopes for actual visualizations. Min brought me on board by asking, so what are you interested in? He and his group continue to ask us that question, and when we tell them, always thinking that surely this time we're asking too much, they respond consistently that we're providing them, yes, with problems, but with problems that are useful for them also in their research. They are, for example, already working with many more variables than the myopia program does. They really want to give us something that we really want to use. And it seems the harder we make it, the more they perceive that they'll be moving their own field forward also by doing so.
We have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much. Do you have more visualizations you'd like to share with us?
Not yet. These are very preliminary, and so we apologize for that. We did present this when we applied to come as extremely preliminary, and that's we're hoping to have more visualizations by around about November.
Do you have any projects?
Not yet.
That's a good question. We'll have to talk with our collaborators about potentially developing one.
Yeah.
I'm interested in, I suppose, the number of poems you want to visualize at one time. It makes sense to treat all of Shakespeare's sonnets as one unit and then individual poems, but are you thinking of, doing something more along the lines of all 19th century poems that you can shove into one bin or anything like that?
So I'm going to jump in because I have a very strong opinion about this, and I think right now what we're looking at is a tool that you'd be able to shove any poem into.
Any single poem.
Any single poem. And once we have that, given our idea that a single poem is a large data set, right, in and of itself, from there we think that we're going to have the technology and the tools and the foundation to begin to look at groups of poems as data sets as well. Is that here?
Yeah, and Kate alluded to this earlier in the presentation, but we want to be able to ask the kinds of questions that, again, Ben brought up, that to look at large numbers of poems to see if what we understand as the beginning of a new poetic movement really began when we think it did, or if there are seeds of it even earlier in quote-unquote more minor poets. But to really, and to look at, say, specific historical events that maybe sparked certain dynamics or subjects in poems. So we do hope in the long term to be asking those kinds of contextual and historical questions as well.
Very different undertaking. You probably know Natalie Easton's work.
I don't, but I'm...
She's creating a database of 19th century single author poetry monographs.
Okay.
She has data.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it seems like such a small project to get to the point where you can create a really useful, complex visualization of a single poem, but it turns out that that's an enormous task all by itself.
Yeah, any thoughts of running this backwards and generating poems?
Well, maybe we do want to explore how a tool like this might help us write poems that we wouldn't already write. And whatever method we might use or way we might use the tool to do that, I think is maybe an open question. That's one possibility, but there may be others.
I mean, and it's not impossible that that would happen because it's already causing us to write essays about poetic form that we would not otherwise have written, right? And so getting inside a poem or poetry in a different kind of way, we think is already going to make these changes. But we have a colleague, Craig Dworkin, who's a fabulous experimental poetry poet who will probably be figuring out how to use this instantly to generate.
Yeah, I was really interested by the stuff at right towards the beginning where you were reading the poems and then comparing that to the text of the poems as the computers were attempting to parse them. I was wondering if you found anything interesting about the difference, if there's anything that you can learn from the ways that the human reader will write the poems differently than raw text seems to imply.
Well, we didn't persist in that direction of research, and really we were only at that point looking at duration, literally timing how long each of us used to speak or articulate a specific word, and we only ran it for that one poem. So the answer to that question is no.
Well, almost no, because one thing that we did notice, the only really noticeable thing, is that it takes both Julie and me longer to read a poem than it takes a computer to read a poem. So this tells us something about what people know about poetry that computers don't know about poetry, at least until somebody programs it in. Does that answer your question a little more?
So I was thinking about this, the same thing, and I wondered if for that second visualization with the hops between things, did you use one of your readings or an average of the times you took? Or what?
Actually, this is based purely on the written text.
Okay.
The only one that incorporates spoken, it was the first brick one. So this one, all of the others are based on the script.
But that really illustrates, I think, the enormous complexity of the task, right? Because this is a visualization that's based on what computers know about how to read poems, not about what poets know about how to read
What's
poems.
version has to always rhyme, which the computer apparently doesn't.
Exactly, and that's what I was trying, as we were looking at this, why, that's a question that we were wondering, and why just using that cluster of the short E, S, and T, sometimes in different orders that we would still hear as rhymes, are completely absent in this. So that's exactly the point that I was trying to make. There's a whole lot else going on here that's not captured yet.
The specific question that led me to throw that poem up on the board, and this is kind of how serendipity works, right? Because I was thinking, what would it be a poem that's a good example of this that I happen to have to memory, right? And that was the one that came to mind. But what the collaborators asked us was, what do you mean when you talk about how time works in poetry, right? So I thought, okay, so this one, and I was thinking line break punctuation, and started down that path, and then we ended up talking about the way in which sound is morphing throughout that poem. We literally stopped in the middle of a sentence and said, maybe we should talk about this other thing instead.
An out there suggestion, not probably what you're doing, but what occurred to me from the recordings, I obviously noticed that it was shorter, and you mentioned that the computer's version was shorter, but I was thinking about scansion and how, measuring emphasis would probably be something that, number one, any human reader would do very differently, and that a computer would do very differently if you simply programmed in, in the word marriage, the emphasis is on the first syllable, and it's always something that I've been interested in, because scansion presents itself as a real thing, but isn't. I don't think it is a real thing, because you can change your emphasis, and so I would love a computer
how does a computer figure out what is an important word, right, in the
Yeah.
poem? And one of the things that our collaborators are actually working on doing for us is apparently there are computer models out there that will put together certain sounds with certain emotional colorations, which is very interesting to me. And one of the things that we're interested in looking at is whether in a poem, if you visualize which emotion as the sounds would have it happening in the poem, and then actually take words that have emotional valence that can be identified and lay a visualization of that over, do you get something similar one to the other? Does the sonic, what's happening sonically in the poem actually reflect the emotional valence that's implied by the words or not, right? So this is a research question.
Well, and it sounds as though what you want to visualize is changing, and is that right? That it's sort of contingent upon what you can visualize with the computer, is that? Because, you know, it'd be one thing if you sort of, it sounded as though you said you started with magical poems, rhyming poems, and you first excluded free verse, thinking that you could, I suppose, represent the sonic elements, at least the most simple ones with. But then, you know, abandoned that, it sounds like. So are you still trying to figure out what to visualize?
We're working on that, and what happened was we had to figure out something to emphasize at the beginning, right? Because you don't just start and say, we're just going to visualize everything, right? So it took us a while to identify sound as the thing that we want to start with in terms of visualization. Took us a little while to get to the point where we said, we really want this not to be about data, right? But to be about capta and the experiential quality of poetry. So how do we do that? So there are all kinds of different questions or elements in play right now.
Even sound is multidimensional because it could be just the IPA or specifically stress when you are reading a poem aloud, how exactly.
And I think that we're trying, and all of this, as Kate said, is sort of in stages, but we are still interested in all of that, you know. So it's not a question of do we want that or not that. It's just a question of what do we prioritize to do first and then next, because as you're saying, the experience of a poem and even the sonic experience of a poem in time includes, and back to our bigger point about this is a large data set. It's not just the IPA, but it's the meter, it's everything. So yeah.
You know, so as we keep going back and saying this has to be time dependent, this has to be in motion, this has to be, et cetera, one of the things that we're really describing is the learning curve of collaboration on both sides. That we're still very much in the process of learning what's possible, and sometimes something I think should be easy turns out to be really difficult, and something I think will turn out to be really difficult turns out to be really easy. And at the same time, they're actually having to learn way more about poetry than they ever thought, since we're not counting nouns, right? Way more about poetry than I think they ever thought they would.
You might consider having a phonetician and or a phonologist involved, because what you have here is you're essentially counting segments, and certain vowels in English are longer and shorter inherently, and you're picking up on that, but it sounds, based on what you said, that you're really more interested in the overall melody of the language, which is known as prosody. And you're wanting to distinguish poetic prosody from regular old sentential prosody, which is how you could teach a computer how. So you have to, there's word stress, and you can teach a computer to make word stress, and you can even teach a computer how to do the whole sentence stress, so the sentence intonation. But what is harder, and I think this is where your focus is how do you capture the emotive qualities that is gonna be a kind of word stress added on top of all of this, that the poet and the human knows, A, and B, what does this echo about our readings of poetry in the past, or are perhaps some of these metaphors remind us of other poems, and so we read it a certain way. Those would be the things that would be nice to overlay and visualize.
Right, so one question I would have for you is that we do have a linguist on board. Is that sufficient, or do we want to make
What
sure?
kind of a linguist?
I think he's not a phonetician, but we will be asking.
Well, I mean, this segment stuff is only good if you want to talk about long and short vowels
Right.
and, you know, what pattern matching, simple pattern matching, but you're interested in prosody,
Right.
which has
Yeah.
not much to do with vowels.
Yeah, and I would say, just to add on that, we're not just interested in identifying pairings, but to identify the movements between them too, but your point is still certainly valid.
And when we talk about the experiential quality of this, one of the things that we know is, we have these visualizations that are not very finely grained of Julie reading the poem and of me reading the poem. And Julie and I both know that if it were a recording taken 10 minutes later or the next week, right? If it were very finely grained, we would be able to see the differences, right? Depending, and how the way in which one word is pronounced in a particular reading has to do with the way an earlier, a word 5 words back was pronounced, that alters, right, the way in which you're moving into the words that come after it. So none of this stuff right now is being reflected in the visualizations, but we're told that it should be possible to
I
do
mean, one
this.
thing that you can do that phoneticians do all the time at this level is you can compare the length of the same vowel. And then you can say, oh, okay, Julie's pronouncing this longer here. Does she feel that this imbues some certain emotion? And then you might see patterns. That's simple to do with what you already have.
And it eventually, wouldn't it be great to be able to capture tone?